They were boys who had traveled thousands of kilometers fighting, risking their lives. They had the right to have a good time with a woman. These words were spoken by none other than Joseph Stalin. Far from punishing the aberrant rapes perpetrated by the Red Army when invading Berlin in 1945, the leader of the Soviet Union endorsed the atrocities committed by the soldiers. However, this is not an isolated case, as the scene of women suffering sexual abuse is one of the most repeated during the Second World War. Anyone who thinks that the brutality of this enormous conflict ended on the battlefield is very wrong. For this reason, in this new video, we will discover the extent of the abuse and violence that the victims received, learning about the cases of German, Italian, and Filipino women. We warn you, you are about to immerse yourself in one of the cruelest chapters of humanity. Prepare to experience hell in life during the darkest years of history.
To me, it was a nationwide catastrophe, one that affected an entire generation.
Komm, Frau Rabotti. How often did I hear that 70 years ago? Because I was a war trophy. That word conveyed all the horror. We always said I was taken when we talked about it. You felt guilty. You felt dirty.
Kidnapped, abducted, condemned to sexual slavery. Since ancient times, women have been considered war spoils, or simply a right of the victor over the defeated. And if we talk about the Second World War, it has not been the exception. It is the largest war in the history of humanity, with a conflict that impacted the entire planet and mobilized more than 100 million soldiers from the great contenders. With all these men called to fight on the battlefields, the female figure took on a new relevant role in society. They maintained homes and performed all the jobs that were previously almost exclusive to the male gender. However, when the enemy advanced, they were also the main target of abuse and violence, mainly with brutal systematic rape, one of the main crimes in times of war. Among the scenarios that showed this behavior most clearly is the eruption of the Red Army in Berlin when they finally defeated Adolf Hitler's forces. Sexual assaults were massive. However, when the news reached Stalin in Moscow, there was no rebuke for his men's actions. He received reports stating that all the trapped women were being raped to the point of exhaustion, in shifts by 10 to 12 Soviet soldiers at a time. This caused a significant increase in suicide attempts by all of them, but the talk of revenge for crimes committed at the hands of the Nazis sufficed as justification. As absurd as this argument was, the cruelty they displayed was simply inexplicable. The military sought to satisfy their most basic sexual appetites, turning to their wild side. The nationality of the poor women never mattered, nor did their age. They all fell like prey in their hands. They could shout that they were Polish, Jewish, or even Russians recently liberated from a concentration camp, but nothing saved them. Although there were voices within the Soviet army condemning these acts, no way was found to prevent such brutal abuses because discipline in the battalions was non-existent in these matters. Hence, the absolute failure to stop the barbarity. The High Command, starting with Stalin, had no interest in stopping it. In fact, those who felt comfortable with this action thought that no nation had suffered as much as Russia in ending Nazism, and this was their right.
They stormed in, and we just sat like this. I don't know if we screamed or cried. We trembled sitting there. One soldier came in, looked around, saw me, and yanked me towards him, and Mother cried out. I know exactly how he threw me on the floor. And then on the doorstep, it happened. Only my mother screamed, and then we lay in one another's arms and sobbed.
This is the chilling testimony of Leonie Bialis, one of the victims of enemy soldiers. But there are hundreds of thousands of stories like hers. Estimates of the number of women who were raped can vary, but using data from Berlin's two main hospitals, the figure was estimated to be between 95,000 and 130,000. One doctor deduced that the young women abused numbered approximately 100,000 and 10% of them died, mostly by desperate suicide. In any case, throughout the territory that had been dominated by the Nazis, it is estimated that the Allied occupation left a toll of at least 2 million abused German women, to which groups of other nationalities were added. Many reports claim that the number could have been even higher, but women soon learned to disappear during the so-called hunting hours. Young daughters remained hidden in attics for days on end. Mothers went out to fetch water only early in the morning, when the Soviet soldiers were sleeping off the previous night's alcohol. Also, in an attempt to escape all violence, some would smear their faces with dirt and try to disfigure them as they walked down the road dressed in rags, hiding their entire body from head to toe and limping. Another option was to cover their skin and face with red spots simulating typhus. Any trick that would lessen the chances of attracting soldiers was worth trying. Sometimes the greatest danger came from a mother revealing the hiding place of other girls in a desperate attempt to save her own. Beyond that, there was little else they could do, and they were limited to listening to the pitiful moans of those victims who had not been so lucky that night to avoid their predators.
In the house next door were women who had been evacuated from Munich. Suddenly in the night, I heard terrible screams and cries. I asked what had gone on there because I couldn't sleep. And they said, yes, people had come and raped the women. The screams were so horrendous.
Women who faced a group of Russian soldiers saw their options dwindle. They were usually gang rapes, sometimes involving more than a dozen soldiers who had no other option than to give in or die. And the same fate was the punishment for anyone who tried to defend them. All members of the forces who witnessed the outrages not only accepted them, but encouraged them. And as if that were not enough, their own compatriots, scared to death, did not help the victims who suffered the serious abuses in the least. However, at this point we must understand that it was not only the Red Army that was behind the hell that German women were living.
In general, you can say that not enough has been made of the fact that all troops committed acts of sexual violence. The Soviet Army, the Americans, the French, and the British. I think that if we are focusing primarily on the violent acts committed by the Red Army, we'll remain stuck in a very simplistic, explanatory model.
It is true that Soviet soldiers were relentless in their brutal treatment of their victims, whom they used as sexual spoils under the banner of revenge. However, other Allied forces came to this German territory to take advantage of a key and painful aspect, using it with the sole objective of satisfying the sexual instincts of the combatants. They knew that in devastated Berlin, women suffered other difficulties, such as hunger. Western armies learned to get what they wanted by paying with food. Within this aberrant category, tobacco and chocolate were some of the currencies most commonly used by soldiers of the United States troops. Although this American tactic allowed them to claim that they did not force women, it did not exempt them from the violence that involved exchanging sexual favors for food, another level of cruelty to which German women became accustomed. However, the land of the Nazis was not the only one to suffer the consequences of the fall of Hitler's regime. Women were brutally affected by the war in other corners of the conflict. And if the Führer had been the reason for the suffering in Berlin, Another member of the Axis, like Benito Mussolini, was the downfall for the Italian women. After the landing in southern Italy, and from their base in Naples, the Allies' objective was to reach Rome to liberate it. It was just over 200 kilometers, but the weather conditions of the winter of 1943 and the effective German and Italian resistance based on successive defensive lines made the advance difficult. The French Expeditionary Force, under the command of General Alphonse Juin, was chosen to overcome this challenge. They knew that the greatest obstacle was the so-called Gustav Line, about 100 kilometers from the capital, whose main axis was located in the town of Cassino, and above all in the monastery of Monte Cassino. Situated on a 1,100-meter hill, this was a strategic position to defend the route to Roman soil. It took 4 months and several attacks to defeat the fighters entrenched in the ruins of the monastery, destroyed by the Allied bombing, and in which the Nepalese Gurkhas and the Gumiers from North Africa, specialists in mountain fighting, played a special role. Now, it was time for the reward. As a rallying cry for going out onto the battlefield, Juin had declared, "If you win this battle, for 50 hours, you will be the absolute masters of everything you find beyond the enemy ranks. No one will punish you for what you do. No one will ask you for explanations." And so it was.
Se pure mia madre diceva quello che ti fa mio figlio, le mie nipoti, diceva a me, no.
Avevo 11 anni e mezzo. Pensavo di morire, sì, dico, mi ammazzano. Sì. Se mi ammazzavano forse era meglio che mi veniva via.
That idea of not having to be held accountable was engraved in the minds of one group in particular, the most ruthless in the Allied offensive. These were the aforementioned Gumiers, the name originally given to the irregular tribal forces fighting alongside the French army in the 1900s in southern Algeria. They would later become known as the Moroccan colonial troops. They took the general's miserable harangue literally and gave rise to the so-called Moroccanate. This was the name given to the mass carried out by North African fighters against civilians of both sexes and all ages after the Battle of Monte Cassino, with the approval of the officers of the French Expeditionary Force. From the numerous documents collected to date, we can say that there were at least 20,000 cases of sexual abuse. However, this figure does not reflect reality, as several medical reports from the time warn that a third of the abused women, either out of shame or modesty, chose not to report it. If we take into account that the Moroccans carried the attacks from Sicily to the gates of Florence, the figure begins to rise considerably. Many towns were visited by the Gumiers, and many historians are not afraid of being wrong when they claim that a minimum of 60,000 Italian women suffered at the hands of these savage fighters. Many of them on several occasions, later experiencing a living death.
Marocchini mi hanno ammazzata, mi stanno portata via, mi hanno violentata, mi hanno scarnita, tutto in faccia, tutta sgrampiata.
Medical professionals at the time were able to corroborate the brutality with which rape was carried out. They pointed to anal and vocal cord lacerations from penetration, broken teeth to prevent victims from biting them, impalements and castrations, the latter reserved mainly for men who tried to defend their wives, mothers, or daughters. Mutilations were also common, and the number of infections such as syphilis and gonorrhea increased exponentially. But the terror did not end there. A parish priest who tried to save a group of women by hiding them in the church was tortured and sodomized. And despite all this, General Alphonse Juin never condemned the violence committed by his own soldiers. On June 18, 1944, Pope Pius XII urged the newly appointed president of France's provisional government, Charles de Gaulle, to take action. A year later, 360 Moroccans had been prosecuted by French courts for what had happened on Italian soil. But that was not even the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, many of the victims were unable to continue their normal lives. The suffering left a mark on them, and a large majority of the women ended up committing suicide. Certainly the Moroccan was brutal, and one of the most ruthless chapters in the rape that occurred during the Second World War. However, to the story of the devastating advances of the Red Army in Berlin and the Goumier in Italy, a third episode must be added that is just as aberrant. We are talking about comfort stations, where thousands of so-called comfort women, mostly girls, were forced to serve for years as sexual slaves of the infamous Imperial Army of Japan. This heinous crime began long before the other two. Its origins take us back to the Nanking Massacre in China, between late 1937 and early 1938. Japanese soldiers raped and murdered some 50,000 women during their attacks on the city and established centers where many others were forced to remain. Over the years, the forces that joined the Axis in the World War repeated these practices on all the fronts where they fought. It is estimated that there were approximately 200,000 victims who were subjected to forced prostitution, whose common denominator was endless physical and spiritual pain, suffering brutal punishments.
I was 15 years old. It was the first time I'd seen a Japanese man. We lived in a coconut grove. That's where 5 Japanese soldiers saw me doing the laundry. So one soldier stabbed me here before doing this. This other one here. He struck me here, like this. There, see? Then he took me here and stuck my head in a drum filled with water. I couldn't breathe anymore. Then he bound my hands behind me and tied me to a jackfruit tree. And then he raped me.
This is how Pilar Frias, a Filipino woman who was part of the Japanese loot, remembers her particular case. She was barely a teenager when she fell into the hands of the ruthless invading troops, and from the beginning, she could understand what awaited her. The comfort centers were established in China, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Burma, Indonesia, and the Philippines, among many other places. Women of all these nationalities ended up being captured by the brutal military of Imperial Japan. None of them could overcome that tragic life, and they refused to forgive what happened several decades ago. This is how one of the victims represented it in a heartbreaking way.
They tied me to 3 other women and took us with them to the mountains. That's how they kept us. That night, they raped me again. 6 of them this time. I can never forgive them for all I suffered in their hands. Every time I look in the mirror and see this, they took away my life, my dreams, my dignity.
Beyond seeing the lives of these people destroyed, the Japanese continued to carry out savage mass rapes until the final days of World War II. An example of this was the Manila Massacre. This has been a crime often forgotten when remembering the war, but that does not mean that it was not as ruthless as others. Between February and March 1945, forces under the orders of the Japanese general, Tomoyuki Yamashita, perpetrated a terrible massacre in the Philippine capital, ending the lives of more than 100,000 people. In fact, some sources indicate that the death toll reached 500,000. But that was not all. The Japanese knew that American troops were on their way to liberate the city, and they did not hold back even a shred of cruelty. The Bayview Hotel was used as a center. According to testimony at Yamashita's war crimes trial, 400 women and girls were rounded up in Manila's Ermita district and subjected to a panel that selected the 25 considered most beautiful. Many were just 12 to 14 years old, but that did not stop them from being locked up so that Japanese soldiers and officers could take turns raping them. The military groups did not stop there, searching every corner where people took refuge. They entered ferociously and attacked with bayonets babies and children of mothers who begged for mercy, but were only sexually assaulted once the killing was over. On one occasion, at least 20 Japanese combatants raped a young woman before mutilating her by cutting off her breasts. The man in charge of this brutal act placed them on his chest to make his companions laugh. They then poured fuel over the body of the victim and 2 other women who had also been to death and set them all on fire. Scenes like these were repeated daily. Sexual abuse by the Japanese imperial forces was another trademark of the conflict, proving that all the armies that participated in the conflict had something in common. Coming to the end of our video, we can assure you that revenge and lust were present among the Allies, as much as in the Axis during World War II. And although that battle seems very far away, nothing has changed. Women continue to be victims of this type of cruel behavior in current conflicts, while the perpetrators continue to evade justice, going unpunished for their crimes. Now, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for staying until the end. We hope you join us in the next installment of Military History.